It's interesting how some things come full circle. It was a while back on this podcast. Rafe Kelly was who's sociology, human movement play. He was talking about hip hop and like African dance, and he was talking about how Israel Adesanya, who you work with, uh, came from a dance background before fighting, which I find fascinating. And then, what do you know? I was talking with James DeLacy and then got connected to you. I'm like, oh, you train Israel, and he's doing long isometric holds. This is like this really cool little circle here that came from. So, yeah, tell me a little bit about your background in training fighters and how did you land on that in your career path?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've basically always, so when I started as an S&C, I worked in development programs with multiple different sports, and fighting was kind of always my passion project. So I, started out, worked with cycling a lot, worked with rowing, worked with sort of multi-sports in like a high school and then sort of early national level from like a development program perspective before shifting into cycling and rowing elite sports. And so that's over the span of about 10 years. Basically from day one, I just loved combat sports, but there wasn't necessarily a lot of opportunities in that space where there was funding. So basically, as I trained and worked within these different sporting organizations, cycling, rowing, were the biggest ones. I was always sort of just doing a little bit with fighters on the side, and from a participation perspective, funny enough, I wasn't super sporty when I was growing up. So in high school, played a bit of table tennis, bit of football or soccer, this and that. But nothing really clicked until I got into a martial arts gym. So it was a good friend of mine was a kickboxer. And from that, I kind of just fell in love with probably the movement side of things, more than anything. And got into watching a bit of UFC at the time. And that was probably how things came together in terms of sparking that interest.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I wonder sometimes about like the mentality, well, yes, the physical qualities that go with fighting and combat sports and what we can learn from that. But then also like some of the mental pieces. And that's what intrigued me with the long iso holds, just because I think anyone who's done them knows that. And yes, toughness, there is a strong context specificity to that without question. However, I always do see that people who tend to quit early in ISOs, it's often more than just muscles cashing out. And I'm curious what you've learned with those long ISO holds and some of those things that are a little more tough with martial arts competitors.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. A few weeks ago, I had Izzy back in the gym. He's been in the gym, but we've kind of been in this reentry phase after a little bit of time, and we tapped into some longer long isos. And he looks at me. He asks for the time. I tell him the time. He just says, "Oh, so we're going to that place." Like into the Hurt Locker a little bit. And it's funny because he was relating that. Basically, he was putting that in the same category as when we get into fight camp or whatever it is, and we're starting to have to push these sessions. We've got to reach inside a little bit and find something, which I thought was pretty cool. And I definitely agree. I find that the long isos, the people who are willing to push themselves harder are the ones who are going to get the most out of them. Mm-hmm. And whether or not that's in a single effort or if that's like accumulated over time. I know Gus, and Angus Ross, who's one of my colleagues at HBSNZ, he talks about those long isos as being basically your average motivated athlete's training method, because it's uncomfortable. You've got to be very motivated to move through it, but potentially on the other side of that, some pretty cool and advantageous adaptations. But yeah, I definitely agree.
I was curious when I saw the video you had posted with Israel doing like a long lunge hold. I was like, is that the 5th minute of the lunge? How long do you have those athletes doing those for? Because I know Yeah, I talk with different people. I talked with James about how long he has athletes hold those ISOs for, DeLacy, and, yeah, I'm curious where you
Yes.
land with that.
Yeah. So for me, honestly, the more the better to a certain point. It depends on what we're sort of going for. Sometimes if I'm doing them within sets, I might pull the duration back a little bit, and it generally is going to be relative to the athlete. So a lot of the times when we start them, we might start around sort of 2 minutes, like 90 seconds to 2 minutes. And basically, I want to build the capacity athlete to push that up to closer to 5 minutes, depending on what we're trying to chase. But I remember Gus used to say that there was a bit of magic around that 5 minute mark. If you could reach a 5 minute ISO, you're potentially good things will happen. So that's kind of been the target, which is I haven't had many athletes who are able to reach that, both sides, one side 5 minutes, the other side 5 minutes.
Yeah, the lunge is an interesting one because compared to, like, a wall sit, you wall sit, you do it and you're done, and lunge, I've been there several times where it's like, "Okay, I did the one leg, and that was really, really brutal. Now I'm gonna walk around for, like, 2 or 3 minutes and shake my legs out. Then I'm fine
Completely agreed.
leg." A lot of times I start really high up in the lunge, and I'm, like, kind of afraid to get down. I kinda have this little bit of PTSD from the last set. Feel like, the Jay Schrader stories, I don't know if I think sometimes they get a little exaggerated, but a lot of times it's
Mm.
like, "Yep, 5-minute lunge, 5-second rest, other leg."
Oh yeah, no.
In a minute, no, you jump the vertical jump PR or something. Sometimes it feels like that sometimes, and you hear those kind of stories. But, I think, yeah, reality is a little different sometimes.
Yeah, Izzy's referred to it as trying to like chase the shake on them. And I quite like that as a way to think about it in terms of, pushing into that like productive time within that isometric lunge. As soon as there's a bit of like involuntary muscle action, you're probably in quite a productive place in terms of time frame. And how long you can hold that for, I think will help extend that out in terms of effectiveness.
Yeah, you're saying basically once you get to that shaking place, like involuntary, once things start to
Yeah.
shake a little bit, and I do think about that in the sense of I look at the different I was like the willful brain, which and that kinda athletic, like that subconscious reacting brain. Like I think if you wanted to make ISOs easier, sometimes you just talk to somebody while they're doing it or distract them
Yes.
or
Yes.
you have them dribble a basketball. But I I think that which makes it a little more involuntary, but then it's almost funny because you end up getting there anyways if you hold it long enough because then stuff starts to shake and it almost
Yes.
distracts you, to be honest. Like, it's something else to think about and notice besides muscles just burning and those types of things, and but I do agree, people talk about that with the shake type thing. Is it valuable? Is it not? Sometimes I see people just get put in novel positions they're not really used to or they don't have a lot of
Yes.
control there. It's pretty
Yes.
easy to get a shake there. You're not easy,
Yes.
but it's easier versus the hard way is to find something you're actually kinda strong in, and, I know that having the heel off the ground tends to amplify that too quite badly.
100%. Yeah.
So, yeah, I do think that, yeah, people who have I think about it this way too with, like, those long ISO holds is because it takes such an amount of will to get to that place. If you have that amount of will to get your body to that place, hopefully that's something that you can transfer and use in other areas, but it's also a little bit
Yeah.
frame of mind. It's a little less chaotic. It's a very, like,
I
controlled
very
and muscular place to do that.
Yeah, I very much agree, to be honest. I think that that cognitive element is something that gets brushed over a little bit, especially from like scientific populations, which is interesting because essentially the brain governs everything that we do, governs the way that we use energy, governs the way that we activate muscles, how much, and when it comes to combat sport, especially MMA, I talk about, if we're looking at training for a 5 round fight, that's very, very, very taxing. It's a very hard event to train for. And the only way that you can essentially meet the demands of competition is to be extremely efficient, basically, through all your body systems. The only way to reach maximum efficiency is you need to have the cognitive control to regulate those systems
Mm.
adequately. as soon as you lose that, all of a sudden you're using an excess, you're no longer efficient, and it's hard to maintain um, a given task. So yeah, it definitely does transfer. The people that push through there, I do notice other people who can push through well in competition. The people who stop early often don't do so well.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a really I think it is under-researched. I think it's a thing where anything with a mind, we always pay a lot of credence to it initially. We'll
Mm.
say, "Oh, yeah, that's so important." And then we don't really we don't really that's about it. We just leave it there. There's very little consideration of that in the training process. And I funny enough, the researcher is escaping me, but the individual who showed that fatigue started in the brain or the way we
Mm.
perceive it well before the body is actually cashed out. And to your point about efficiency, it would strike me that, yeah, somebody who's better at regulating, like, even to the point maybe they don't feel the fatigue as soon as somebody else,
Yes.
they can then manage it better and all those things. And is it that trainable? How trainable is that? Or how can we go about helping an athlete to do that? Because just saying do a 5-minute lunge, you know,
Yes.
it's their own quest in some perspective of it all.
And I think it is a cool novel way to, train a little bit of that grittiness, I suppose, or some of that mental toughness per se. With a lunge, it's productive for that time duration. It's very different to, say, if you were doing some sort of maximal conditioning activity.
Yeah, yeah.
That's obviously significantly more taxing. Um, but yeah, I do think that it's quite common that we often disassociate brain from, or cognitive from, physical, and it's important to remember the connectiveness of those systems.
Performance is built on a spectrum of training methods, from high velocity skills to power training to strength work. And on one end of that spectrum, on that strength end, you have the most targeted work in the form of machines. And this is part of the reason that so many top speed and strength coaches have their favorite machines to deliver that targeted stimulus. For decades, Hammer Strength has been a top provider of reliable, effective machines that are trusted by coaches and athletes worldwide. They fit seamlessly into that total performance program, delivering that targeted strength stimulus. When it comes to your machine-based strength training needs, think Hammer Strength. If you want a path to connect the dots of human performance, you can join over 1,000 coaches and athletes who have taken a Just Fly Sports online course. My 5-star review courses include the mini courses Speed ID, as well as Sprint Drills Reloaded. My full-length offerings that are CEU certified include Elastic Essentials and Sprint Acceleration Essentials. To learn more, you can head to justflysports.com/courses and take the next step to level up your human performance knowledge. Let's get back to the show. Yeah. Maybe an ISO is, tell me what you think about this, Bill, that an ISO is like still enough that you can regulate your breathing better. And some of those real um, autonomic nervous system qualities, is that I don't know if I'm the right wing of things, but you can get, there's a stillness enough that you can start to get into some of those more subconscious processes versus the very typical, all right, we're going to condition, let's go to the track and run 10
Yeah.
400s or something, where you can't do it. It's such an externally presented thing that you're probably not, you're just going to be surviving it. That's probably the main thing that's going
Yes.
to be happening, where maybe something that's a little more still, it gives you a chance to actually go in and work with it. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think of course, when we do these, we're taxing the muscles pretty significantly, but there's always an opportunity to sort of, stay present within that, emphasize breathing. Breathing is one of those other things that, it plays a large role in some of the efficiency components. But I think what's so great about the ISOs is that, athletes generally respond really well when they have targets and when they have goals, and having the ability to sort of push those with ISOs and, have these tangible goals that we can work towards over time helps, I think, push through a bit of that as well, which is helpful. Where, we can do that with conditioning too. But again, it's often not the case. Often it becomes a little bit more ad hoc. And obviously the stress is massive. I think with anything, it's just really important to make sure that, just to come full circle, that whatever the intervention is matches what we need for the sport. and not in excess. And for fighters, a lot of the times, conditioning is definitely not something that's lacking. So it's great to
Yeah.
have these other means, to elicit some of that.
Yeah, I'm sure that a great many of the fighters you work with have seen their fair share of 10 by 400 or whatever it is. I'm actually not that familiar with fight conditioning, but I've seen wrestlers train, and it almost seems like, in a way, I almost got this thought that the more inefficient the conditioning is, the more they seem to like it. Like, it's
Yeah,
not
seriously, it's
for them, but yeah.
it's interesting because then we've got it is like a lot of it is driven by this like wanting to push the mentally, and that's a coach thing. So I think like
Hmm.
in these scenarios now we're pushing cognitively or mentally, but we're not matching what we need physically. So now there's a mismatch in that domain. Yeah, if you can find both, I think it's great. It probably does tell to the importance when it comes to some of that mental stuff, because I don't think you'll find a single coach who coaches high level athletes in a combat sport standpoint who won't say that's important or even a priority.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it is interesting with I think about the ISOs, and I wouldn't say it's the only way, but it does strike me if you were to like rate the efficiency of someone's conditioning program, and like on the most inefficient end, you're basically doing like CrossFit stuff, a bunch of burpees
Yeah,
and ugly running, and like it's like all that stuff. It's almost like the most you're gonna get really conditioned for your physical systems, but you the entropy to get there is very high versus it's almost like the most efficient burn in some ways, I think, is just an ISO hold. But of course, that's almost more muscular than, aerobic. There's not a lot of aerobic. So
yeah.
it's like, okay, how do you get more of that out of it? Um,
Jeez.
yeah.
I think, yeah, even the ISOs, I think, are probably like surprisingly aerobic in terms of the output you can get from them. Obviously, from a cardiovascular standpoint, cardiorespiratory, there's the demand is low, but
Yeah.
in terms of the muscle operating aerobically is probably higher than
Yeah.
you'd realize. Like
Mm.
we've thrown some of the NEARS sensors on them before, and you'll get a pretty steep desaturation. Through those movements, which truthfully I still need to explore a little bit more in terms of
Yeah.
like how we can manipulate that more with conditioning. But it does highlight that there's definitely there is a conditioning component to it as well.
Hmm. I totally agree with that. Yeah, recently, there was just a day or two in the last year, I just threw the polar heart rate on. I was doing some ISOs, and it was more the game to see how low I could keep my heart rate as it got
Mm,
difficult. The funny thing is, the ISO lunch could be killing me, but my heart rate was not. I mean, it wasn't going to be
yeah,
any zone two, if that. Honestly, for me, it's like very low heart rate. But yeah, the thought would be, well, what's happening in the muscle? And then in some ways too, keeping the heart rate low helped me to it made it easier. Like the perception of difficulty would be easier. And I found keeping with like Jay Schrader talk about like a 4-8 breathing or having some sort of symmetrical breathing also seemed to mitigate that. But yeah, I think it is really interesting to just to dig into the muscle piece there. I'm sure anyone who's in combat sports, they're gonna be doing a lot of aerobic once they actually get training too, like the breathing
yeah.
one. How do you mix like so in how you view the total package then of a conditioning? How does like salt bike running, like those more traditional cardio pieces, how does that enter the picture?
Yeah, it's always I think with the if you watch any MMA videos, the assault bike you'll see in basically every video. So
Mhm.
the assault bike is quite common. But there's limitations on both sides. Like the way that we look at conditioning is oftentimes there's obviously different emphases that you need to have at different times. We'll run like a VO2 max test without the gas exchange using NEARS to establish thresholds, as well as like a Wingate type test. And sort of, I think the biggest thing with MMA conditioning is understanding that there's just so many different components that need to develop, and there's only so much time. And you can't forget that skills training is like the absolute most important thing. So basically, all training from a conditioning or a strength standpoint needs to be maximally efficient to get the desired results for an athlete. So the only way that we can do that is we really need to have a strong understanding of the physiology of the athlete and what they bring to the table. So then we can target those more work on areas. So using those tests, basically we can start to break down exactly what are the highest priority work on. So we'll look aerobically initially. We can break aerobic down into looking at how the cardiovascular or respiratory system operates relative to the muscular system. So sort of dividing those two areas. Because for MMA, we have a sport that is very muscularly dominating. So you often find that it's not necessarily the heart that is often the limiting factor for combat athletes, it's the muscle. So then based on that, we might look at different modalities when it comes to training some of the aerobic activities. Running is good. I like running, to be honest. It gets a lot of slack, I think, online, especially in combat spaces. But I think what I like is the repeat, elastic nature of just being on your feet, which, from a fascial perspective, I think is probably advantageous. And, if you want to go look back through history, all the greatest boxers have always performed road work. So I think, there are definitely components to that are valid and important, especially for sort of setting a base. The other part that's important to think about is when we touched on the muscular system being so important is, the primary area that you find mixed martial arts athletes will fatigue is the upper body because of all the clinch work, the grappling work. And when we then break that down into, cardiorespiratory and muscular, oftentimes, it's the target becomes more about not so much the supply of oxygen to those muscles, but actually trying to improve the way that the muscle utilizes that oxygen. In which case, that becomes more important to then use methods that utilize the upper body more. So that's where an assault bike can start to help out. However, there are limitations to it because now you're doing both upper body and lower body, and potentially, depending on how important that target is, I might need to have a little bit more emphasis on the upper body. Yeah, that's probably how I would break down from a base aerobic standpoint. The assault bike is interesting. It's interesting in terms of its influence on different aspects of power, which I think is not necessarily discussed a lot.
Yeah. Usually you see an assault bike and I just think like a CrossFit competition or something. I like the assault bike. It's like the reciprocal piece, like the arms and the legs are moving. And I think it was Kyle Waugh, who's a coach who's actually near me in Cincinnati. He had talked about athletes with like range of motion limitations and just throwing them on the assault bike for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And a lot of those got better just because flow, reciprocal motion, upper and lower body. It's like, also, and it's a great training tool. I like what you said about the running piece. Cause I agree. I think running does get a bad rap. And that's one of those things where for track and field, I've found that, especially for myself, but then many other athletes like me, more elastic type driven people, that the long sprint stimulus is pretty helpful. And anything can be abused, of course. I think that's the thing, is that the abuse of those things is what gives it such a bad rap. Or if that's just the only thing, like track and field programs where every day you just go out and do some form of mishmash long sprint tempo, and it's just like, oh, this is so boring. And but in proper usage a few times a week and in the right dose, it's awesome. And so I just think it's unfortunate sometimes that pendulum swings to get things a bad rap, when in reality there's a lot of good things that they do offer.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, for a lot of, if you're looking at a lot of track and field events, sometimes from a training standpoint, we're looking at, how do we maximize the training stimulus, or how do we maximize these systems? For combat sport, like we discussed before, we're really trying to maximize the efficiency of the systems. So from a muscular standpoint, being able to maximize the efficiency of those elastic qualities plays a massive role. when it comes to sustaining energy output over time. And it's one of those aspects that it will play into conditioning. It's just not necessarily well understood, I think is probably the best way to put it.
It's interesting. I was thinking, or I wanted to ask you if you've ever done any work where you've combined the two in like a single session, like an ISO hold and then a run, or ISOs and aerobic, because I look at the interplay of that. If you talk about efficiency, I think in my experience, that breeds a very highly efficient program. I'm curious if you've done any work there with anything like that.
Yeah, we have. So we've done, and this is probably more in a specific prep phase because, I mean, what you're describing is very, very much a sport specific quality in MMA in terms of going from these,
Yeah.
maximal isometric movements like grappling, anti-grappling, to then being back into dynamic. So we have done quite a lot of that, and I think it's definitely something that we've only done it in specific areas, though. It's probably the best way to put it, for the most part, anyways. And I think it's been really very advantageous. In terms of general, maybe not as much, but it's an area that I'm quite interested in. I'm quite interested in how you've used them, to be honest, Joel.
Yeah. I use it a fair amount with locomotion stuff, running type work and tempo work and interlacing it. I'll throw a plug in for Elastic Essentials because it's a part of that. It's my course plug for people who haven't taken that yet. But I really find that there's a few ways you can use it as a prep, like a lower time periods, and use it as even like a lengthening type thing. You could call it like a controlled active stretch, all the way to getting up to some of the higher amounts where it's like you are digging into the system, like the
Yes.
actual muscle metabolic system. And there's some really cool outcomes with both ways to go about it. And I was going to ask you, Bill, you mentioned this with I just call it like a Moxie because that's the only name I know it by. But you mentioned the blood oxygen meter that like you put on someone's leg or arm when they're doing an ISO, and it tells you like the lack of oxygen or the deoxygenation. This takes me back to I was Evan Pycon, who was on this podcast a long time ago. And it
Yes.
was like, yeah, all that stuff. I was so intriguing, like how deep do you take a set to get the muscular stimulation? And if people talk about ISOs and you're like cycling through energy systems and all this stuff. And I'm like, what is going on under the hood there for that? Because we would think of a long hold and just think, okay, well, now we're just working slow twitch. But with deoxygenation, to my understanding, and like occlusion training, there's also some benefit to fast twitch because the fast twitch, they have to work. I mean, they're going to take themselves to exhaustion because they don't have the oxygen. So it's like, or the oxygen isn't there. So the fast twitch has to do something. I'm curious what you think of all that, especially sports science background. You're working with these things. For me, it's a little bit of speculation and then just, working with different things. So I'm curious what you think there.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's interesting. I think, when it comes to a lot of the energy system, I guess what's typically taught, it's quite interesting once you sort of go under the hood a little bit in terms of, I think we're always told that, these are the energy systems, they work in this way, but in reality, they all work together. But in terms of how that looks, that's probably something that's maybe not as well understood. And when we start to then bring in these sensors like Moxies or Train Red, it really does like change the paradigm of how we view some of that stuff. And I think that when it comes to the ISOs, what's quite interesting is you'll see that you put a Moxie on someone who's doing a long isometric, you'll still see a relatively rapid downshift in terms of oxygenation. So you see like, well, the oxygen is, being pulled and utilized very rapidly. And, regardless if you're doing like a maximal sprint or if you're doing something like even a long isometric or a maximal isometric, you're still going to see that the rate of shift will be slightly different. But like for the most part, you are going to be using both of those, fast twitch muscles as well as solid twitch muscles. I think one of the more interesting areas that is maybe not as well understood is like the aerobic qualities of fast twitch muscle. So in terms of looking at mitochondria and then how to develop mitochondria in fast twitch, which we can do. And because there's always going to be different types of athletes, and this is why we do a lot of profiling. But just observationally, you'll see guys who are just very explosive, like very twitchy, and you'll see guys who sort of diesel through. In which case, like the interventions that we use for each of those different types of athletes, they shouldn't be the same. For the fast twitch guy in a sport like MMA, you know, you can't rely on, as having energy for a round and finishing an opponent in a round. You have to basically do your best to maintain the gifts that this person has while allowing them to express in the total duration of the fight. So one of the best area, so there's two options for that. We could do a lot of endurance work, and we could just, we often tap into more of the slow twitch fibers, improve cardiovascular, improve mitochondrial content, and that's great. But then the athlete goes into the fight, they express power and they get tired because you haven't necessarily trained the mitochondrial or aerobic qualities of those fast twitch fibers. So I think that's where utilizing strategies that are more, more high intensity based strategies, or maybe using a combination of longer ISOs to higher fatigue points, as well as more maximal based for time, is valuable in that area. But it's interesting. And then the next part of that is, well, how do you modify their game plan / strategy around optimizing their innate gifts?
Yeah. There's always a lot of different if you have a bunch of different athletes do like a 3-minute ISO, I imagine you're going to get a lot of different responses.
100%.
And I think there's something it's really important to understand that we don't all have the same tools, but I think that on some level, just seeing how athletes respond, how you give them a couple minutes rest after and see what their movement looks like, just different things like that. I think in going through coaching and just interchanging it with other things or seeing what happens after or the next day, I think there's always a lot to be learned from that as well. Bill, I wanted to ask you too. We talked about the iso lunge and that movement, and is there, and as well as the upper body demand and just that muscular demand of MMA, is there any favorite? Is there a favorite battery of isos, body weight iso holds that you really enjoy using? Any things that really stay in your program routinely?
We do a lot of push-up holds. I'm a big fan of the push-up holds, long muscle length. So basically just doing them on dip bars or something like that. So we're really getting quite deep and holding those for time as well. Probably one of my favorites is like an offset single arm isometric, which James posted up recently. Shout out to James. So that would be hanging, your legs are off to the side more, so you get that really nice sort of flexion and lengthening through the lat and the oblique, and adding tension at the top of that. That's probably my favorite one, to be honest. It translates really well to striking. When it comes to striking, like, you want athletes to be able to strike well at an end range. That helps access some of that end range and provides a little bit more activation in that area. Those would probably be my favorites.
Yeah, I love single arm stuff and single arm hold stuff is so good. And I wanted,
agreed.
Yeah, underrated for sure. In terms of fight specific or I mean, in really so many ways, I think a lot of this stuff is just athlete specific. I mean, I always like conversations where it's like, yes, this is the most specific to this population. We draw out many things for many groups. And I know you've talked about eccentric strength development or eccentric rate of force development. I know you do a lot of flywheel work that I'm excited to get into. Tell me a little bit about what some of the top fighters that you work with, what are you seeing from some of their trends in strength and when they exhibit in some of those power movements? So, outside of the isos, the body weight long holds, tell me about the power side. What are some of the things that you see that really define the high level fighters that you work with?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. We do a very comprehensive strength and power testing battery. And pretty much since we've started doing it, on that list is probably at minimum 10 UFC fighters and many pros, like quite high level pros, and then amateur fighters as well. And one of the things for me has been I'm just very interested in what differentiates different types of athletes. And as soon as I started doing it, I worked with the UFC through that as well. So I was able to mirror some of their testing, get some great normative data for them too. So that was very helpful when it comes to utilizing that. Like one of the first things you realize is that these guys do not jump very high. So the average vertical jump, and this is on a valid force plate, so it's impulse momentum, is about 35 centimeters for a UFC athlete. So straight away, you probably realize that, well, having massive amounts of lower body power or just power in general is probably not what differentiates these guys in terms of what makes them so good. And when you start to look through like UFC fighter versus non-UFC athletes, like you can't actually differentiate a UFC athlete from a low level athlete based on something like jump power. So just general power qualities. So looking into that a little bit deeper, this is what's helped form some of my philosophies that we've discussed. It wasn't so much the jump height, wasn't so much the concentric power. It was actually the how fast they could preload and how fast they could turn around at the bottom was the only metrics that really were able to differentiate these athletes, which I thought was very interesting. Because to me that basically screams efficiency. So like more efficient using like a stretch shortened cycle. Eccentric qualities were more developed, which translates back to efficiency and movement. But in terms of any of the concentric qualities, that's not the case. So I found that very interesting, and it definitely matches my observations of athletes. Obviously, this is in general. What I will say is that if you want to look at the athletes who are knockout guys, like force to the ground is one of the biggest determinants. But at a whole, that's been the primary observations, which is very interesting. And it was even just going back to, trying not to go too off topic, the landmine punches. Used to use landmine punches all the time, and I ended up, going through some pretty good guys, other guys. I was finding that the best punches just performed terribly on them. So I ended up just getting rid of them, which was very interesting. But it was kind of like from if you were to consider a punch and you would consider a landmine. So when you punch, there's this like there's ground contact, like full body drive. There's like this impulse that starts, and you're really trying to transfer force, through the ground, through the body, through the hand into the opponent. And there's a couple of athlete quotes that have really stuck with me. And one of them was from Conor McGregor, and he talked about when you punch, like you need to I forget exactly what he said. He basically said you want to engage and then disconnect the shoulder and then re-engage the shoulder on impact, which kind of highlights that maybe like a relaxation piece. And so that's Conor McGregor, obviously one of the best punchers in UFC history. And then Bivol, who's one of the best boxers, he discussed a punch should be like having a stone connected to a rope. So the rope is the arm, the stone is the fist. So when you then look at a landmine punch, it's like, well, you're just active all the way through the drive phase. So it's very, very different. And after seeing that, I kind of decided that I was putting my life at risk for maybe not the best reason, so I got rid of them.
Yeah, that's so fascinating with that, because I think that really speaks to what is sports specificity. And a lot of people, I think, especially in the social media age where you are highly rewarded for anything that looks anything like the sport you're doing, even if it could have a negative transfer. It's like people are more incentivized to put those things out there. Or I think a lot of times if we don't pay close attention to the actual results and transfer, we might end up doing something that might not be needed. But the thing that you saying that brought up with me is, this was just actually a few days ago before we did this recording, is Liz Gleedle, who's a javelin thrower. She's been on this podcast. She had a video of her working with a rubber band and working basically basic javelin pull positions with the rubber band. This I would relate to that rock on the string to a degree, because she talked about how humans mimic the textures of our what we're touching, basically what we're working with. If we work with a band, and we wrap it through our chest and our arm, and we stretch it, our body can kind of mimic that. Or probably a really good way to, I think, to put it, that anybody who's worked on a trampoline or jumped on a trampoline, I think probably just about everybody listening has jumped on a trampoline at some point. You jump on a trampoline for like a half hour, and then you go to the ground and you try to jump. You got nothing, man. Like, I mean, it's like I think if someone wanted to do a fun study and really wanted to dump like their master's thesis into this, I think it'd be hilarious. But like immediate post trampoline vertical, it'd be down like 40% because we mimic that texture. And in that case, the trampoline does all the work for you. You mimic this hyper slow rate of force development and turnover thing for however many bounces, and you get off of it. And now your body is so untuned to the ground. And of course, you go in a few hours and it'll wash out and go to sleep and come back the next day. But I was just thinking about that same idea applied to the landmine versus the rock on the string. You're grabbing the whole system and you mirror this rigidity through the whole system, like you said, versus wasn't the ultimate this layers of, yes, like you have the rock at the end, but then you have this kind of loosey-goosey, connecting piece between the hand and the shoulder, at least as it needs to be. And yeah, that's such a cool anecdote because I think so often we're just incentivized to have everything be more force, more rigidity, more stiffness. Those are terms that people love, but it's like, okay, not everything can be that. Like
Totally agreed.
Yeah.
And I think as well, like it's so dependent on the athlete in the sport and basically how old they are. Like a sport like, but MMA is interesting because you can look at MMA, but then you can also look at the polar opposites in different sports. So you could then look at MMA. Obviously, you've got these hybrid athletes. Then you can look at something like Muay Thai, where these athletes are very much just, all about striking power. It's the output's high. They're very elastic, elastic. And then you can go and contrast that to wrestling, where they're just very muscularly strong. So you kind of get these two ends that you then have to pull together. And some athletes, depending on maybe their background or just their physiology, are going to exhibit more lean towards one side of that or the other side of that. But it's just really important to think, well, what do we need to develop so they can meet the demands of what they're experiencing in competition? And that might be based on a specific opponent. That might be on the fight style that they have. And from an S&C standpoint, we then can start to pull more from different sides to try to give them the balance that they require.
Yeah. You got me thinking a little bit about that elasticity and like the kicking and that type of thing versus like a grappling jujitsu. Yeah, it's such a different end of the spectrum. And I was thinking about Yaroslava Mahucic is the world record holder in the women's high jump. And her sporting background, you mentioned your own sporting background, like not so much team sports. Hers was dance and like karate or something like that.
Really?
Yeah. And I was like, what, like these if you had a hyper elastic person and what did they prefer? And I was even thinking about my daughter is kind of like that. Like she's somebody who she doesn't, she plays team sports, but she's not like all about it. But I think she would love like taekwondo. I've been meaning to put her in that for a while. And she likes jumping. She likes
awesome.
Yeah. So I'm like, oh, that's good. We got to get that going. Like I think that's an underrated activity for young athletes. Like if we're talking about
agree.
Yeah.
It's so funny. Recently, speaking to Gus, he was talking about there's a girl in the New Zealand Sevens team. I forget her name. I don't watch basically any sports other than fighting. But she's a weapon, and apparently her background is in Highland dancing.
Interesting.
And just like the way but she moves in a way that is unlike, that's a superpower. But I just thought that was so interesting.
Is that like Irish dance? Is that the same thing? Kinda like
It's a little bit different, but it's like a very, very like bounce based. It's
yeah,
crazy. Go and search it after this. I watched a couple videos. Like it's crazy from like an RSI like bounce perspective. That's just like all they do. Anyways, and then you look at how she moves. Probably makes sense. I think one of the most interesting questions though is like what happens when you have an athlete who maybe this is their superpower, and then it starts to diminish, which is often the case, naturally, that is something that happens as you age, potentially based on training environments. That might happen as well, or like training stimulus, or lack of training stimulus. So I think that's probably one of the areas that is that I find quite interesting at the moment.
yeah. Yeah, I really the whole Irish and Highland dance type thing, I imagine they're probably pretty similar, but, like, a lot of, like it's almost like a lot of little pop up and down
Yeah, yeah,
position,
yeah,
but, like, some high random, like, crazy high kick
yeah.
stuff, like,
Like crazy coordination as well.
yeah. Yeah, there was an NFL player who apparently took Irish dance or was really into Irish dance and said it really helped him, and then I went and really looked into his story. I forget his name, but he, like, fumbled the ball all the time, so apparently I was like, "Okay." I was, like, watching him move, I was like, okay, for a younger athlete, I could definitely see transfer because right, anything works when you're younger, right? Like, and
Yeah.
what about someone who's real high level? And I was watching this guy, and I was like, wow, he is really fast out of the backfield. Holy cow! But then, yeah, he had fumbling issues, so I think that's why he didn't make it very high in the league. But absolutely agree. There's something there, even to the point where I've become more a lot of people hate on like the speed ladder for just general sport performance, and I've gotten more into it honestly, just because it's just something to play around with a little bit, like just different rhythmic kind of dance moves, for lack of a better word. And
I like it as well.
yeah, yeah, if, I think it just depends on how you treat it, and
Totally agree.
yeah,
I think we often think about, maybe, you look at, I think the biggest argument against the speed ladder is that it's not true agility training, and that's true. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to use it for agility training. Like, for instance, we go back to efficiency. What's a massive part of efficiency is like muscular coordination overall. And we can train like a coordination component on it. Another component that we might want to train is just general quickness. We can train that. And additionally, if I want to get more out of an athlete, like buy-in is good. If I can get them doing a warm-up drill, they're enjoying it, they're trying, they're ticking some of those boxes, then I think it's a win. So I'm a fan. Like, it's not something I use to train agility per se, but I like it as for using for different drills.
yeah, yeah, I agree with you, and I think I know one coach. I think it was Nathan Huffstutter for people who are familiar with his work. I was reading he coaches soccer and does like sports performance, I believe, and he was saying there's a certain 1-2 rhythm that actually is essential in sport, and some like a lot of kids just get it naturally. But if you don't
Yeah.
use the ladder to at least have a foundation, but I think there's rhythm shifts, and I think when people just talk about the ladder as like, hey, just do this drill because this is just our series and we do it every day and it's going to make you fast, like that's the wrong context. But what I was getting at is I was just one of those like Irish dance compilations popped up on my YouTube one day, and you always look at like the calf and lower leg development of some of those athletes. It's really, really impressive. And so I was really molding my speed ladder warm up around some of those positions.
Awesome.
And I was like, oh, this is great. And honestly, even like a lot of good jumping and sprinting is based off a good forefoot lever. But I think also some of the things that gives those athletes big calves is they actually let their heels kind of hit the ground because they kind of like cross the heels in front of each other. And okay, like obviously doing that all the time
Mm.
isn't the pattern you want, but it does work the calves a lot very athletically.
Yeah, yeah.
So I just for that very general reason, I was like, I was really getting into that and like a lot of interplay between heel down, heel up, heel down, heel up. I was like, ooh, this
Mm.
is good. Maybe I could start my own, like, if, exercise. I was just thinking about like exercise, like those old VHS exercise. Like, I don't, that's, yeah, kind of a funny thought I had. But anyways, yeah, I wanted to go back to Bill just quickly. I find it funny. As soon as you said these MMA guys have a really low vertical in the back of my head, I'm like, okay, everyone who's really into track listening to this is like, oh, like, like, I gotta, let's talk about. all this stuff. But I think we can learn so much by that spectrum of it because, like you said, there are things even in a. I mean, it's not like these athletes grew up playing volleyball. Probably, like even like you said, it's almost like there's a very specific. It's a very specific skill, and but it's like at the core of every athlete is a certain motor. Like you said, it's efficiency, it's the ability to high rate of force development on the way down. And I would think that, and Cody Hughes recently was on this podcast talking about a key metric for land based jumping and sprinting athletes in team sport is eccentric rate of force development on a force plate. So these things are not
Interesting.
dissimilar.
Yeah.
Uh, it's just MMA players that what you don't win because of like flying kicks like in the movies. Like you're vertical, it's a lot different there,
It's interesting because I remember Gus, because I was talking about it with Gus, and he was looking through some papers as well, and it's the same thing. Like from a concentric force development standpoint, you, you weren't able to differentiate high level sprinters from non either. So it's kind of interesting. Like that's when you start to push like competition levels up a little bit. So it's like because of what I was looking at with this, and this is the same as what Gus was looking at, is it's not like looking at what is the difference between a high level and like a average competitor. It's like what's the difference between a high level competitor and a world class competitor. So, and that's a very different thing. Like who's on the podium and then who is left after that. That was kind of my take from it because I think there's just so many lessons that we can learn from some of that.
Yeah. So with the that eccentric rate of force and more of that just pure system, not even skill, not confined even to the skill of jumping, but just those core qualities. I know you do a lot of flywheel work. I've become more back on the flywheel train
So,
recently. I don't know. I think it's just having enough conversations with Paul Cater. If you're familiar with Paul's work, Paul's
yeah,
been using flywheels and Versa pulleys forever, and I think maybe he's just worn me down, or I don't know what. Maybe I was talking about James again. I don't know what it was, but I've been using it a lot more. And I really love flywheel work, especially as a warm up, even for weights and other things. It's really good. I mean, anyways, all that being
yeah.
said, I'm not gonna let this be a question that's actually me just telling everyone that I'm using flywheel. Why? How do you use? Tell me, how do you look at the flywheel and the eccentric force for fighters, and how does that integrate into your program?
Yeah, so basically, if we were to go back to some of that jump testing, it was, that basically that turnaround at the bottom, which is, on the force weight, you look at it as time at zero velocity. And that's essentially like what the target is. So for fighters, the efficiency between like contractions is very important. If you don't have the eccentric abilities to, one, put the brakes on, two, like have the ability to actually bounce out and move efficiently through that, whether or not it's through the system when you punch or if it's on the ground when it comes to footwork. If, you don't have the ability to quickly absorb and then redirect force, then ultimately you're slow. So, and that's regardless of how much like just general power you're able to put out. So that's one of the bigger emphasis that we have with it. We also use it for like a fascicle-length shift
Hmm.
with the intention of enabling greater speed qualities. So we'll play around with that as well as like the longer isometrics to achieve some of that. And when we talk about trying to increase fascicle length, like the one of the things with MMA is if you were to simply aim to shift muscle fiber type to a 2x from a 2A, is probably not an advantageous shift because you do need the oxidative qualities. So in terms of that as a mechanism to create power changes or strength changes, force changes, it might not be the most advantageous for competition. But when it comes to looking at other mechanisms, if I can increase fascicle length, then I potentially have the ability to increase maximal contractile velocity without changing muscle fiber type, and without compromising any aerobic based qualities. So to me, that's a massive win. So that's something that we'll spend time on with more like elite level athletes. I don't spend as much time on it with developing athletes. I think like meat and potatoes first. Um, but we'll use more heavier flywheels when they're in like an off camp phase, so like an off season phase. We might make that more of a focus. So that's more like overloaded eccentric with the flywheel. Um, might use the motor as well to help enable some of that. And generally, we'll start to lessen that off, but keep it in as we get into the in camp or the competition phases. Thing with fascicle-length is you can develop it reasonably quickly, but it goes away really fast too. So you kind of need to maintain enough volume to keep that in there. So normally we do like a maintenance dose weekly as we move through, but with a lot less distribution. And I will periodize it very similar to how you periodize just in general. I'd, start off heavier, then I'd move it to being lighter and more repeat. It's quite fun when you get to lighter load flywheels. Um, it becomes quite violent, and that's
Yeah.
exactly what you want. So,
Mm.
that's pretty much how we use them. Then we'll pull them out, and we might just do a few like bits and pieces a couple of weeks before. A few like drop sticks and little bits and pieces to help try and just maintain over those last couple of weeks.
Yeah. Do you think that flywheels, similar to sandbags, Julian Pineau, who's got me onto sandbags, talked about every time you pick up a heavy sandbag, it's kind of like a little fight in its own
Mm,
way. And of course, not everything has to be highly specific, but I I feel like a flywheel has some of those qualities a little bit too. Like it's something that you're kind of fighting against a little bit in a way.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. And I completely agree. It definitely wakes people up,
Yeah.
which is also important because when you consider like if you're especially if you're in in-camp phase, athletes often they're pretty tired. Like there's
Yeah.
always going to be a fatigue component to it. In which case, as an S&C, you need to get the most out of them because if you train without intent, then that's basically what you're going to get from it. You're not gonna develop athletes who have explosive capacity. So I think it helps from that standpoint as well. So we do a few same with adding like little reaction games and things like that just to get athletes awake.
Yeah, absolutely. With the fascicle length and the eccentrics, one of the things that I've always been hesitant with more traditional eccentric work, like in the like loading up barbells or weight releasers, is one, it's just the configuration to get there. But then
Yeah.
it does seem like, to me, it seems like traditional barbell eccentrics or even pneumatic barbell eccentrics have the capacity for a lot more soreness
Mm.
than a flywheel. I mentioned like
Yeah. Agreed.
entropy, like the efficiency of getting the thing done. It has struck me as the level of use I'm at, that flywheels are a lower entropy version. They're a
Mm.
cleaner version of getting that eccentric overload. Basically, it doesn't. Would you agree with that? It's not quite as just on the system as the traditional barbell way of doing it.
Yeah, definitely. I think especially with flywheels too, like you can change, as you move to more of like a faster base eccentric, it's quite different in terms of some of those residual effects.
Mm,
But yeah, I definitely agree as well. Like so sometimes even for some of the pretty reasonably heavy flywheel sessions, you don't feel too bad the next day.
yeah,
And I mean that is also advantageous. But I think there is a place as well for definitely is a place as well for more of the grunty, overloaded
yeah,
eccentrics. It's just you've got to be a bit more aware around what else the athlete is exposed to and set some expectations for them around what potentially might happen from a sport specific standpoint, which is absolutely fine as long as it's all accounted for and a part of the overall plan.
yeah. Just to put a bow on like the flywheel part, there's a lot of other stuff I wanted to ask you, like elastics and fascial system. What exactly that is, and the Marinovich training system, and a lot of those ideas. But maybe that'll have to wait towards down the road. I just wanted to ask you like ratio of flywheel based work to barbell work, and this is something I talk with Paul about as well. Is
Mm,
what percentage, or if you have like a dial on the strength component, what percentage of that do you get out of flywheels versus more traditional barbell?
I'd say it'd probably be if we were to exclude things like plyometrics, and I'd probably say it'd be between 25 and 50% if I was like really pushing into one of those phases. Probably more like 25%, to be honest. It's always something that occurs. I might spend more time one session out of the week than the other time. Um, but yeah, I'm always doing everything that makes sense. It just depends on the type of qualities I want to develop. Like I think really important with anything, and especially with the internet, starting to like try and understand the internet a bit better, is that we can achieve more than one thing. So when we train for one thing, it doesn't mean we drop everything else. So we're not thinking about other stuff. We still might be using barbells for RFD or maximal strength at the same time as doing that. The first exercise might be maximal strength based. We might have like the secondary as the primary flywheel exercise. So I'll always mix it in with those, but I'd probably say it's around that like 25 to maybe up to like 35-40% at times.
Got it. Yeah, you mentioned plyos. Actually, just the very last thing I have for you is, and you talked about like fascicle length too. And honestly, I wish I was a little bit more up on my sports science memory with eccentrics versus plyometrics and these types of
Mhm.
things on fascicle length. Or people talk about high speed sprinting and fascicle length on
Yeah,
the
definitely.
hamstrings. And so certainly the ability for dynamic work too also maintain some of these things. I know for me, I've kind of leaned on those items a little bit more, but tell me just a little bit about do you really try to use plyometrics to help maintain some of those qualities as well, along with those small doses of the eccentrics in more that power phase or in season type thing?
Yeah, it definitely is a component to it. I think like depending on what phase we're in, it might change that a little bit. I think like the best way to do it from a dynamic standpoint is sprinting. And whether or not you're doing unloaded sprinting, you're doing sprinting on a hill, you're using a sled. I've found that there's from a dynamic standpoint, there's no better substitute than that. I find that maybe some of the other I think plyometrics in general who support that. Um, but nothing beats sprinting. And just to like double back a little bit, when we talked about the assault bike, one of the biggest downsides of the assault bike is that you're very much capped at quite a slow maximal cadence. So and you don't have the same, so you don't get the cyclic rate that you would through even a stationary bike, or especially like on feet from a sprinting standpoint. So we use one of our tests. I'm not sure if Gus has talked about the inertial erg, or you probably heard about like the inertial erg that we can basically measure power at different cadences. Athlete goes from flight camp. Athlete uses assault bike. Optimal cadence goes down, so the ability to produce high speed power almost always becomes impaired. So utilizing like sprint based work has been one way, alongside some of these other modalities that we've helped combat some of that.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Well, yeah, I'm glad I tacked that on there at the end because that definitely rounds that out. But yeah, thank you so much. But I wish I had little bit more time to ask you a few more of these questions. But awesome talking with the topics we were able to cover, and I appreciate you making this call happen from there in New Zealand. So thanks for being on the
Uh,
show.
No, I appreciate it. I been listening to the show for a long time, so this is very cool.